The tenter man of 1890s Ghent steps into the damp finishing room before dawn, and tonight we walk beside him, following the rules that seem strange at first, though each one carries the quiet sense of cloth, weather, labor, and time. Settle in and let the pace of the work slow your breathing. The air is cool enough to wake your fingers, and the brick walls hold the night's moisture like a soft grey coat, while somewhere beyond the yard, the city of Ghent is still half asleep. Its canals dark, its cobbles slick, its mill chimneys only beginning to draw their first thin breath of smoke. You can smell the room before you understand it, the clean sourness of wet fiber, the faint oil on iron parts, the wood of the frames swollen slightly from years of steam and rain, and the old lime dust settled in corners where no broom quite reaches. In 1890s Ghent, where cotton mills and finishing houses stood close to workers' lanes and water, the tenterman's work was not loud in the way spinning rooms were loud, yet it had its own patient music, the tap of a peg, the creak of a tightening rail, the soft slap of cloth being lifted while still heavy from washing. We are not hurrying through this place, we are letting the rules reveal themselves slowly, as they would to your hands. The first rule is simple, and it sounds almost too fussy to matter. You never stretch a cloth until it has had time to settle after the wash. You let it hang, or lie folded on the bench, or rest in its damp weight, because cloth has a memory of every pull placed upon it, and if you ask too much too soon, it will seem obedient in the morning and betray you later in the rain. The Ghent tenterman knows this the way you know the feel of a familiar door latch in the dark, not as a theory, but as something learned from spoiled pieces, angry merchants, and the quiet shame of seeing good work draw crooked after drying. So you stand in the dim room and wait, not idly, but with a waiting that is also work. Your palm rests on the selvage, that firm woven edge made to take the hooks, and you feel whether the dampness is even from end to end. Too wet, and the cloth stretches like tired dough. Too dry, and it resists creasing around each hook and leaving small wounds that will show when the light changes. This is why the old rule made sense, though it could seem strange to someone who only counted minutes and wages, because the cloth did not live by the clock on the wall, and neither, in this one small matter, did you. Outside, the morning has not yet gathered itself. A cartwheel passes somewhere near the lane, iron against stone, then fades behind the thick walls. The canal smells of mud, coal smoke, and cold water, and when a door opens briefly to the yard, that smell comes in with the pale air. You notice how the cloth cools your wrist when you lift it, how it pulls downward with the weight of water, how the steam from the washhouse leaves a faint shine on the window glass. The first rule is really a lesson in patience, and the tenter man of 1890s Ghent begins his day by obeying what cannot be forced. And when the cloth has rested long enough, and the grey dawn begins to find the high windows, we move with him to the frames, where the strangest rules become the most useful ones. The tenter frames in a Ghent finishing room look severe in the half-light, like long wooden ladders laid out for a purpose no child would guess, with rows of hooks and pins waiting along their edges. You come close slowly, because every point has work to do, and every careless sleeve knows how sharp a small hook can be. The second rule says that the hooks must catch only the selvage, never the body of the cloth, even if the edge is uneven, even if the piece is stubborn, even if the day is long and your thumb is sore from lifting and setting the wet length into place. At first it sounds like an old man scolding, precise and narrow, but soon you understand it as kindness toward the fabric. The body of the cloth is the part that must be seen, touched, sold, cut, worn, washed, and trusted. It may become an apron in a kitchen, a curtain in a narrow room, a shirt for a clerk, a lining, a sheet, a bolt stored on a shelf beneath brown paper. The selvage is stronger and plainer, made to bear handling, and so your hook belongs there, just there, where the threads run firm and close. We watch the tenterman bend over the first yard, his shoulders rounded beneath a dark wool coat, and you can almost feel the chill traveling through his cuffs as he spreads the damp breadth with small exact motions. There is a smell here of wet cotton and old oak. There is the little rasp of metal entering cloth. There is the warm human smell of breath and cold air, and the mineral scent of water carried in from the wash troughs. By now your hands would begin to know the rhythm. Hook, After hook. Not fast, not slow, just steady enough that the piece does not twist before it is caught. If a hook misses the selvage and bites into the face of the cloth, the mark may be small. But small marks multiply under a merchant's eye, and in Ghent, where factories had grown close and competition pressed quietly against every bench, small waste mattered. The rule against hooking the body also protected the worker from himself. You may be tired. You may be thinking of the bread tucked in a cloth inside your coat pocket, or the damp socks waiting in your wooden shoes, or a child still sleeping in a courtyard house not far from the factory wall. A tired hand takes shortcuts. A tired hand pulls where it should guide, so the rule becomes a rail beside you, something to lean on when judgment thins before breakfast. It says, calmly, the hook goes in the edge, and the edge alone will carry the strain. The frames do not forgive cleverness for very long. Pull too sharply at one place, and the woven threads answer in another. Tighten the upper edge before the lower edge has been set, and the whole piece begins to lean out of truth, as if the cloth has decided to walk away from itself. The tenter man works across and along, letting each small act answer the one before it. In that repeated movement, there is a kind of restfulness, because nothing grand is being asked of you, only attention, and attention, when it is given gently, can be almost as calming as sleep. When the first length is held along the hooks, and the damp cloth no longer sags like a curtain in rain, we follow the work to the measuring rod, where another rule waits quietly in the worker's hand. The measuring rod in 1890s Ghent is plain enough to overlook, a smooth length of wood marked by use, kept near the frame as carefully as a key. You pick it up and feel the polish left by many palms, and you understand that the rule tied to it was not only about numbers, though numbers were part of it. The cloth must be brought to its proper breadth, not the greatest breadth the frame can take, and this is where the old tenter rules sound almost moral, as if a wooden rail and a strip of cotton could teach restraint. But in a finishing room, restraint is not an idea in a book. It is the difference between a trustworthy bolt and a false one. Wet cloth can be persuaded. That is the danger. After washing, fulling, bleaching, or other finishing fibers loosen and shift, and the worker who stretches them can make a piece look broader, smoother, and more valuable for a little while. We can imagine how tempting that might be, especially when wages are low, orders are tight, and the foreman's boots are heard on the boards before his voice comes round the corner. Yet the rule says you stop at the proper mark. You do not flatter the cloth into a size it cannot honestly keep. You do not win an extra finger's breadth in the morning, only to have the garment shrink and pucker after its first hard rain. So you measure and measure again. The rod touches the edge, the lower rail shifts a little. A wedge is tapped home. The sound is soft but exact, wood meeting wood in the damp air. On some days, the cloth behaves easily, spreading to its right breadth as though relieved to find its shape. On other days it resists, and you feel the strain in your forearms as a low ache, not painful yet, just present, like the weight of the city itself pressing gently through the morning. The strange part is that the rule does not simply forbid stretching. Tentering exists because cloth must be stretched, dried, and squared, or it may shrink unevenly, dry in rucks, or carry a crooked line into every later use. The sense lies in the measure. Too little tension, and the work is slack. Too much, and it becomes deceit. The Ghent tenterman lives in that narrow middle place, where the hands must be firm without becoming greedy, and the finished cloth must look clean without pretending to be something it is not. You begin to hear other sounds now, as the day opens around the room. A bell carries from a church tower through fog and factory smoke. A woman's footsteps pass in the corridor, quick but not rushed. Somewhere below, a door latch lifts, and a gust brings in the smell of coal ash and river damp. In this small world, the measuring rod is a quiet judge, but not an unkind one. It gives everyone the same answer, whether the worker is fresh or weary, whether the merchant is patient or sharp, whether the weather outside has turned dry or stubbornly wet. There is comfort in a clear mark. Your eyes may be tired, and your mind may drift towards home, but the mark remains. It asks only that you return to it. And in a trade where cloth passes from spinner to weaver, from washer to finisher, from warehouse to shop, The measuring rule helps each pair of hands trust the pair before it. That may be why the rule survived in spirit wherever cloth was finished, because the work was too shared, too long, and too human to rest entirely on promise. As the morning brightens and the frame fills with pale hanging lengths, we move to the rule about weather, the one that sounds most like superstition, until you have worked one wet week in Ghent. The old rule says you do not trust a bright hour in a damp city, and in 1890s Ghent, that was not pessimism, only experience. The rivers and canals held moisture close to the streets, and smoke from the mills softened the sky, until sunlight could look like a thin cloth laid over grey water. You stand at the yard door and feel the air with your cheek, because the skin sometimes knows before the eye does. If the air is too heavy, the cloth will dry slowly. If the wind is sharp, the edges may pull faster than the middle. If rain threatens, the whole day's neatness may become a patient undoing. This rule made the tenterman half worker and half weather reader. He watched flags, chimney smoke, puddles, window glass, the underside of clouds, and the behavior of his own breath in the cold. We walk beside him into the yard, where the ground is dark between the stones, and the frames nearest the wall are still beaded with last night's wet. The smell changes outside. It becomes broader, with tar, horse, mud, coal, and the faint green smell of weeds growing where brickwork has cracked. The cloth, when carried out, seems to drink the air before it gives anything back. In older cloth towns, tenters often stood in open grounds, where neighbours, inspectors, and passers-by could see where the cloth was being honestly handled. By the 1890s, much finishing had moved into more controlled industrial spaces, yet the same idea remained close to the work. Cloth needed air, but not careless air. It needed tension, but not strain. It needed drying, but not scorching, freezing, or sudden wind. So the rule about weather was practical, and you can feel its sense in your shoulders as you help lift a damp piece that is heavier than it looks, guiding it away from a dirty wall, away from a smoky vent, away from a place where a drip from the roof might leave a mark. There is nothing romantic about a bad drying day. The cloth smells duller. Your fingers stay cold, the floor grows slick beneath clogs, steam clings to hair and moustache, and every task seems to take the long way round. Yet there is a sleepy steadiness in such weather too, because the room becomes a world of softened edges, with voices lower than usual, and the frames standing in rows like patient animals. The Ghent tenterman does not curse the damp for long. He adjusts. He loosens one part, tightens another, shifts a piece away from a draft, and lets the day be what it is. You learn that many rules are really ways of making peace with things too large to command. A mill owner may command hours, a foreman may command speed, a merchant may command a finish. But no one commands the damp breath of the Scheldt and the Ley, no one commands fog in the lanes, and no one tells washed cloth to dry evenly by wanting it enough. The rule makes room for humility, though no one in the finishing room may use that word. They simply say the air is wrong, or the frame must wait, or this piece should stay inside until noon. And by noon, when the light has climbed higher and the first edge of hunger moves through the room, we come to the rule about food, hands, and the small cleanliness that kept work from being spoiled. In the Ghent finishing room, food is plain and close at hand, because a worker's day is long and the body asks for warmth before the mind has time to make ceremony of it. You may have bread wrapped in cloth, a bit of cheese, perhaps something left from the pot at home, and the smell of it is humble against the wet cotton and oiled metal. The rule says you do not eat over the cloth, you do not wipe your hands on the selvage, and you do not bring your cup too near the frame, even if the bench is crowded and your feet ache from standing. It sounds severe until you see what one thumbprint of grease can do. A clean, pale cloth is less forgiving than a dark coat. It remembers the hand, it takes the mark of oil, tallow, soot, tobacco, cheap ink, and the little shine from cheese or sausage. In a city of factories where coal dust drifted through yards and settled on window ledges, cleanliness was not a polished household virtue, but a daily negotiation with grime. We watched the tenterman step back from the frame before eating, rubbing his fingers with a rag kept for that purpose, not perfectly clean perhaps, but cleaner than his sleeve. His bread is dense. His knife has a worn handle, The steam from a tin cup warms his face for a moment before fading into the room. You can imagine the pause, not a long rest, and not a silence, because mills are seldom silent, but a lowering of effort. Someone speaks of a neighbor's child, someone mentions the price of coal. Someone laughs softly at a foreman's habit of checking the same corner twice, not cruelly, just with the mild amusement workers keep for any man who believes his own footsteps are invisible. The cloth hangs beside them, held open to dry, and it seems almost to listen. The food rule also protects a worker's pride. When your labor passes into someone else's hands, you may never meet the buyer, and you may never see the room where the finished textile is cut and sewn. Still, your mark is there if you leave one. A stain is a signature no one wants. So the Ghent tenterman keeps his meal apart, because he understands that care is not only in the grand skill of setting breath, but in the small refusal to let hunger hurry the hand. After eating, the fingers feel different, a little warmer, a little less stiff. You return to the frame with renewed patience, and the room's details come back, one by one, the dull shine of wet boards, the sour sweet smell of damp fiber, the scrape of a stool, the uneven breathing of a stove that gives more smoke than heat. The rule has done its work quietly. It has let the body be fed without letting the cloth pay for it. As the noon hour thins and the afternoon begins its slow passage, we follow the tenterman to the rule about corners, because corners tell the truth before the middle does. The corner of a cloth is a small place, but in 1890s Ghent it could decide whether the whole piece looked honest. You take the first corner between finger and thumb, and it feels thicker from folded thread, a little stubborn, a little less willing to lie flat. The rule says you set the corners first with special care, not merely because they begin and end the work, but because every crookedness can grow from them. If one corner is drawn too high, the cloth leans. If one is pulled too hard, the edge complains. If one is neglected, the middle may look smooth while the whole length slowly twists out of square. This is one of those rules that seems small until you have watched a long piece go wrong. At first, nothing appears ruined. The surface still gleams damply in the light. The hooks still hold. The rod still finds something close to the desired breadth. But as drying continues, a diagonal strain moves through the weave, quiet as a thought you meant to forget, and later the cloth will not fold neatly, will not cut evenly, will not hang as it should. The corner knew first. The corner always knew. We stand with the tenterman as he checks each end, and the afternoon air carries a different smell now, warmer, with damp woolen coats, cooling tea, and the dusty heat of machinery somewhere beyond the finishing room. His hands are not delicate in appearance. The knuckles are broad, the nails may be dark at the edges, yet the touch is careful, because rough-looking hands often know fine work better than smooth ones. You feel the corner give a little, and you stop. Not because anyone has shouted, not because a clock has struck, but because the fibers have said enough. There is a quiet lesson here for anyone half awake in the dark, listening. Many things in a life are like these corners. They ask for attention early, before the visible trouble begins. A blanket folded properly, a door latched before the wind rises, a debt recorded before memory softens it, a kind word spoken before a day grows hard. The tenterman may not phrase it that way, and he has no need to. His wisdom is in the motion of his hands, in the way he returns to the corners after setting the side, checking not from distrust, but from respect for what can shift while no one is looking. The rule about corners also makes the day feel circular. You begin there, and you come back there. You trust, then verify. You move down the length, then return to the beginning. In the sleepiness of repeated work, this returning is almost comforting, because nothing is finished all at once, and no part of the cloth is left entirely alone. We move with him along the frame, seeing how each small correction saves a larger trouble, while the light on the wet surface grows less silver and more dull as drying continues. By late afternoon, when the windows lose their brightness and the room begins to gather its own shadows again, we come to the rule about talking, counting, and not breaking another worker's rhythm. The finishing room is not a library, and the Ghent tentermen are not silent monks, though from a distance their repeated movements may seem almost devotional. Men and women speak in low voices, where the work allows it. and the ordinary talk of 1890s Ghent moves through the room with the smell of damp cloth and coal smoke. Yet there is a rule, spoken or simply understood, that you do not interrupt someone while he is counting hooks, setting breath, or checking the fall of a long piece. A question can wait, a joke can wait, even good news can wait for the hand to finish its line. The reason is plain. Once you stand there, the work has a rhythm that lives partly in the body and partly in the mind. Hook, smooth, measure, lift. Hook, smooth, measure, lift. If you lose your place, you may leave a sag between 2 points, or pull one part twice, or miss the small unevenness that would have been easy to correct while the cloth was still damp enough to listen. We watch a younger worker start to speak, then stop when he sees the older man's eyes fixed on the edge, and there is no offense in the pause. It is simply how the room protects its own attention. Sound matters here. The clink of a hook tells you whether it's seated cleanly. The creak of the rail tells you whether tension has changed. The soft tearing sound no one wants to hear must be caught at its first breath before a small split travels. If talk rises too sharply, these little warnings disappear beneath it, and so the rule keeps the room low and even. Not hushed exactly, but softened. A place where work can be heard. You can feel how this helps the tired mind. When a day is long, attention becomes a small flame, and too much noise blows it sideways. The Ghent tenterman guards that flame without making a ceremony of it. He may nod, he may answer with a word, he may smile at something said near the stove. But when his fingers are moving along the selvage, he belongs to the cloth, and the room, in its practical way, lets him belong there. This rule also gives dignity to a task that others might overlook. To interrupt a man at his careful work is to say the work is simple enough to survive neglect. The rule says otherwise. It says this repeated labor has its own inward count, and the count deserves respect. In that respect there is warmth, though it wears a plain coat. You are allowed to be absorbed. You are allowed to do one thing well. You are allowed, for a few measured minutes, to be no more and no less than the pair of hands keeping a length of cloth true. And as evening begins to press softly against the glass, and the long pieces dry toward their final shape, we move with him to the rule about release, the last patience of the day. The rule about taking cloth off the tenters may be the gentlest and most easily broken, because at the end of a shift, everyone wants a finished thing to be finished. In 1890s Ghent, the streets outside may already be darkening, and the lamps near the workers' houses may be showing small yellow halos through the mist. Your feet ache. Your back carries the memory of bending, your hands smell of wet fiber, iron, and the rag you used after eating. Still, the rule says you do not pull the cloth down before it has dried evenly, and you do not strip one side fully while the other still holds, because release must be as even as stretching was. A careless release can undo hours of care. The cloth may fall in a twist, crease along a damp line, or carry a new strain just when it seemed safe. So the tenterman works slowly, hook by hook, easing the edge rather than tearing it free from the day. There is a satisfying sound when the selvage lifts cleanly, a faint tick and sigh, metal letting go of thread. The cloth is lighter now. It no longer drags at the wrists as it did in the morning. It has become itself again, flatter, truer, and ready to pass onward. We stand close enough to see the surface change as it folds. Damp shine gives way to a matte softness. The smell is cleaner than before, less sour, more like linen cupboards and cool rooms, though this may be cotton, or a blend, or another everyday fabric meant for ordinary lives. The tenterman does not admire it dramatically. He has seen too much cloth for that. Yet he notices, and noticing is a quiet form of admiration. He sees whether the edge lies well. He sees whether the corners answer each other. He sees whether the measure held. The rule about release is also a rule about endings. You do not end a day by wrenching away from it. You loosen it. You fold it. You place it where it belongs. There is deep sense in that, especially for work that has been wet, stretched, watched, corrected, and trusted through the slow hours. Your own thoughts may loosen in the same way as you listen, one hook at a time, one small duty after another, until the day no longer holds so tightly. In the room, voices lower again. A broom moves across the boards, gathering lint and dust into a pale little drift. A shutter is fastened. Someone counts pieces under his breath. The stove gives a last uneven breath of warmth, and the smell of coal fades under the cleaner smell of dried cloth. Outside, Ghent's evening has settled into the canals, and the water holds the lamps in trembling lines. The rule has brought the work to rest without hurry, and that may be why it feels so sensible even now, when the old frames are gone from most yards, and the hands that knew them have long since opened. As the folded pieces are carried away and the empty tenter frames stand like quiet ribs in the dim room, we stay a little longer with the workers' last round, because every careful place has a closing ritual of its own. The last round begins with the frame itself, because a tenterman in 1890s Ghent does not leave wood, iron and cloth dust to make tomorrow's trouble. You walk the length of it with him, close enough to hear the faint knock of his knuckles against a loose pin, and close enough to see how a hook, bent only slightly, can catch the next day's selvage badly. The rule says every hook must be looked at before the room is left, not because anyone expects perfection, but because morning work is kinder when evening has not hidden its small mistakes. It is a humble rule, and the room grows quieter around it. The hooks are cold when you touch them, and some carry tiny threads caught from the day's pieces. You pick them away with patience, feeling the fiber cling to the roughness of your skin. A little lint floats up in the lamplight, pale as flour dust, then settles again on the dark boards. The smell now is older and drier than it was in the morning, with less steam and more wood, less sour wash water and more dust warmed by bodies and work. In Ghent, where so many trades touched textiles in one form or another, lint could seem almost like weather indoors, always gathering in corners, always reminding you that cloth sheds a little of itself as it becomes useful. There is sense in clearing the hooks before sleep, because trapped threads harden overnight when dampness changes in the air. What feels soft at supper may be stiff by dawn, and a stiff knot of thread can snag a fresh piece just when your hands are still cold and your eyes not yet fully awake. The tenterman does not need a lecture on this. He has felt a tiny snag become a pulled line, and a pulled line become a flaw, and a flaw become a conversation with a foreman that no one wishes to have before breakfast. So he clears, checks, straightens, and leaves the frame ready. You may notice how little of this work is separate from care. The day begins with waiting, continues with measuring, and ends with looking closely at what remains after the obvious work is done. That is one of the old rules that actually makes sense, though it may never have been written on paper. A place used by tired hands must be returned to readiness by tired hands, because tiredness is not an excuse to pass disorder forward. It is only part of the weather of the body, like dampness in Ghent's air. When the hooks have been cleared and the frame stands open, we move with him toward the chalkboard and the bundle tags, where another quiet rule keeps memory from becoming slippery overnight. The chalkboard near the finishing room door is a modest thing, darkened by years of wiping, with pale ghosts of old marks still showing beneath the newer ones. In 1890s, Ghent, where a piece of cloth might pass through many hands before it reached a counter or cutting table, the rule says that every length must be marked plainly before it leaves the tenter's care. Not beautifully, not with flourish, plainly. The number, breadth, order, flaw if there is one, and sometimes the worker's mark must be set down before conversation, fatigue, or evening hunger can soften the details. You stand beside the board and hear the chalk rasp, dry and small, against the dark surface. It is one of the gentlest sounds in the room after a day of hooks and rails. The tenterman's fingers leave faint white dust on his coat, and when he breathes near the board, the dust shifts almost invisibly. The bundle tag is rough under your thumb, a small square or strip of card tied by string, and the knot must be firm enough to travel but not so tight that it tears the corner. Even the string has a feel, dry and fibrous, eager to catch on cracked skin. This rule made sense because cloth without a clear memory becomes trouble for everyone. A finished length looks calm once folded, but inside that calm are details that matter, and not all of them can be seen at a glance. Was it brought to the ordered breadth? Did it rest long enough after washing? Was one edge reluctant? Did the lower corner need extra easing? The chalk mark and tag do not make the cloth better, but they keep its story attached to it. And in a factory or workshop, a true story is a useful tool. We can imagine a careless end to the day because every worker can imagine it. Two similar pieces lie side by side. A bell has rung somewhere, someone is waiting at home with soup, or a scolding, or simply the small relief of another human face. You tell yourself you will remember which bolt is which, and perhaps you will for 10 minutes. But by morning the mind has folded itself too, and the details have gone soft around the edges. The Ghent Tenterman knows this, so he writes before he leaves. There is a human tenderness in that plain marking. It admits that memory is fallible, especially after long-standing cold hands and the dull ache across the shoulders. It makes room for the limits of the worker without insulting him. The rule does not say you are careless. It says the day is long and cloth is costly, and a chalk mark can hold what the tired mind should not have to carry. In that way, the board becomes almost companionable, a quiet place where the work's small truths are set down and kept. After the tags are tied, and the chalk dust lies pale along the tenterman's fingers, we follow him toward the door, where the rule about leaving wet coats and cold air outside waits like common sense dressed as discipline. The finishing room of an 1890s Ghent textile house is always bargaining with moisture, and the rule says you do not bring unnecessary wet into it. A coat soaked by rain, a cap heavy with mist, a broom damp from the yard, or a bucket set down too near clean cloth can change the little climate around the frames. It seems fussy from a distance, because the whole trade is already full of water, washing, steaming, rinsing and drying, yet that is exactly why the rule matters. When everything is damp, every added dampness has a voice. At the doorway there may be pegs for coats, or a rail, or simply a corner where outer things are meant to stay. You shake rain from your sleeve before stepping in, and the drops strike stone with a soft patter. The cold air behind you smells of canal mud, horse harness, wet brick, and faint smoke from household fires beginning their evening work. Inside, the scent is different, closer and more fibrous, with cloth, wood, chalk, lint, iron, and the stale warmth of bodies that have worked many hours in heavy air. The rule is not only about the cloth, though cloth is reason enough. It is also about keeping the room legible to the senses. If a worker must judge whether a piece is drying properly, the air should not be confused by puddled coats and dripping tools. If a floor must be safe under tired feet, it should not be made slick by careless rainwater. If a finished bundle must stay clean until morning, it should not lie near the splash of a shaken umbrella or wet wool sleeve. The strange rule becomes sensible the moment you feel your boots slip. Ghent's weather gives this rule special weight. The city is not dry in the imagination, and it was not dry in the working day. Mist could arrive without drama, rain could linger without seeming to fall, and a man might come indoors shining with moisture even when the sky looked merely grey. The tenterman learns to treat dampness as a material in itself, not an absence of dryness, but a thing that moves, settles, travels, and leaves evidence. You notice it on the wall. You notice it in the weight of a rag. You notice it in the time a piece takes to lose its coldness. There is a softness in the rule, too, because it recognizes how closely the outside world presses against the work. A factory is not sealed from the city around it. The canal follows you in by smell. The street follows you in as grit. The weather follows you in as wet cloth and cold breath. So the rule asks you to pause at the threshold, to leave some part of the day's roughness outside, and to enter the working room with the little care that clean cloth deserves. When the door is closed and the colder air fades behind it, we turn back toward the folded lengths, where the rule about stacking makes another quiet kind of order. A folded piece of cloth has a calm look, but in 1890s Ghent even folded cloth can be harmed by thoughtless weight. The rule says heavy bolts go low, lighter pieces above, and nothing fresh from the tenters should be pressed flat before its remaining coolness has left it. At first, this sounds like housekeeping, not craft, yet if you place your hand between two folds, you understand the reason. Warm damp can hide there, a crease can set there, a clean surface can take the shadow of dirt from the piece above it. The tenterman lifts a folded length with both arms, and you feel how its weight has changed since morning. It is no longer water heavy, but it still has substance, a yielding density that presses into the forearm. The cloth smells faintly of wash and air, with the clean chalk of dryness not quite complete. A wooden shelf waits against the wall, worn smooth along its front edge by years of bundles sliding in and out. There may be brown paper nearby, twine, a pencil, and the soft scuff of other workers arranging their own finished pieces before the room is closed. Stacking is a small architecture. Too high, and the lower cloths are punished for being first. Too tight, and air cannot finish its quiet work between layers. Too loose, and the pile leans, threatening a slide that will send good cloth against a dirty floor. So you build slowly, aligning edges with the side of your hand, easing out a fold, letting each piece lie as if it has earned rest. The rule turns storage into another kind of finishing, because work is not complete merely when the last hook has let go. The human detail is simple here. Workers who handled cloth every day could recognize bad stacking by the feel of the pile, much as a baker recognizes dough, or a boatman knows rope by touch. A pile that is too damp has a dead coolness. A pile too tightly pressed resists the hand. A pile that has been made well seems almost to breathe, not visibly, but in the little spaces that let air do what fingers cannot. You learn to place your palm lightly on top, not to pat it with satisfaction, but to listen through touch. There is comfort in making a stack true. It is one of those end-of-day tasks that brings the mind down from larger concerns into the manageable world of edges and corners. You cannot settle the city's wages, or shorten the winter, or make rent easier for the houses behind the mills, but you can lay one folded length on another without crushing the one beneath. In that modest act, there is no grand promise, yet there is order. For a tired worker, order can be a kind of warmth. When the shelves have accepted their quiet burdens, and the folded cloth rests in rows, we follow the last tasks toward the floor, where the rule about sweepings seems small until you see what lint remembers. The rule says the floor must be swept after tentering, but not with wild strokes, not with the broom flung about as though dust were an enemy to be defeated. In 1890s Ghent, the finishing room floor gathers lint, thread ends, chalk dust, grit from shoes, splinters from old wood, and the odd fallen hook that can hide in the pale drift until a foot or fresh cloth finds it. You sweep slowly, pushing the day into a soft line, and the broom makes a dry whisper over boards that have been damp, dried, stained, and worn by countless shifts. There is a smell that rises when the broom moves, not unpleasant exactly, but old and close. Dust, cotton, wool, coal smoke, dried mud, and the faint bitterness of iron all lift for a moment, then settle again in the lamplit air. The broom handle is smooth in the center, where hands have polished it, rough near the end, where no one bothers to sand it. As you move, your shoulders remember the whole day, and the small work of sweeping feels both necessary and nearly meditative, because the room is no longer asking for strength, only steadiness. The rule against wild sweeping protects the cloth as much as the floor. A hurried broom throws dust upward, and dust does not need much invitation to settle on pale fabric. It can land on shelves, cling to damp edges, or hide in the folds of a piece waiting for inspection. The Ghent tenterman has seen too many careless cleanings become new dirt, so he keeps the broom low. He gathers rather than scatters. He lets the bristles do their work in long, quiet passes, and the room seems to exhale under them. Sweepings also tell stories that someone must be willing to read. Too many broken threads may suggest a rough edge on a frame. A bent pin may explain a snag. Damp lint near one wall may reveal a leak that had not yet become a visible drip. The floor is not only what lies beneath the work, it is where the work leaves clues. When you sweep, you are tidying, yes, but you are also listening after the fact to what the day has dropped. This kind of attention belongs to many old trades, and it is especially clear in the tenter's world. The visible task is stretching cloth, but the whole job is made of surrounding habits that keep the stretching honest. Wait for the cloth, hook the selvage, measure the breadth, respect the weather, clean the hands, set the corners, lower the torque, release evenly, mark plainly, stack gently, sweep low. Each rule is ordinary, but together they form a kind of shelter around the work. And inside that shelter, even a tired person can do a careful thing. And when the lint has been gathered and the fallen threads lie in a small pale heap, we move toward the ledger, where the rule about recording faults turns blame into memory. The ledger is heavier than the chalkboard, and in 1890s Ghent it may rest on a desk darkened by elbows, ink, damp sleeves, and long use. The rule says faults must be written down without hiding and without ornament, because an unwritten fault can travel farther than anyone expects. A thin place in the weave, a stain from earlier washing, an uneven edge, a small tear caught on a hook, a piece that dried slowly near one corner, all of it belongs in the record if it may matter later. It is not always pleasant work, but it is peaceful when done truthfully. You see the tenterman dip a pen or take a pencil, depending on the room's habit, and the movement is slower than his work at the frame. Writing uses a different tiredness. His fingers, made ready all day for cloth and wood, must now guide a smaller tool across paper that may have softened slightly in the damp air. The ink smells sharp and metallic, the paper has a faint, dusty scent. If a lamp burns nearby, its heat is small but welcome against the coolness gathering near the floor. The sensible part of this rule is that it separates noticing from arguing. A fault written calmly becomes part of the cloth's path. A fault hidden becomes a future quarrel. In a trade with many stages, no single worker wants to be blamed for every imperfection that appears at the end, and no honest worker wants to pass damage along without a word. So the ledger offers a plain place to put the truth. It may not protect everyone from unfairness, because no rule can do that completely, but it gives memory a spine. There is also mercy in a good record. If a piece came to the tenter's already flawed, the tenterman's note may save him from blame. If the flaw happened under his own hand, writing it down may prevent the damage from growing through mishandling later. You might think shame would prefer silence, yet in a well-run room, silence is often more dangerous than a small, honest mark. The ledger does not scold, it waits. It receives the day in narrow lines, and the day becomes a little clearer. We can linger here because this desk has its own quiet atmosphere. The room behind you is mostly still. The frames stand empty. A bundle shifts slightly on a shelf as the folds settle. Farther off, through brick and window and evening mist, the city continues in softened fragments. A cart, a bell, a call across water, the wet sound of someone walking quickly over stones. Inside, the ledger closes with a low thud, and the sound feels like a latch being set on the day. When the record has been made and the pencil laid aside, we follow the tenterman toward the washing place, where the rule about hands returns one last time before home. The hands that leave the Ghent finishing room are not clean in the delicate sense, but they must be cleaned enough to leave the work behind. The rule says you wash before going out, not only for decency, and not only because a wife or mother might object to factory grime on bread, but because the skin carries chemicals, dust, fiber, and cold damp farther than a worker notices. In 1890s Ghent, after a day among washed cloth and drying frames, your hands may smell of cotton, metal, chalk, soot, and the faint sourness of water that has touched too many surfaces. The basin is plain, and the water may be colder than you would like. You cup it anyway, feeling the sting across cracked knuckles. Soap, if there is some, is not perfumed luxury, but a hard practical thing with a smell like fat, ash, and cleanliness, earned the slow way. The dirt does not vanish all at once. It loosens in grey streams, carrying lint from the creases of your fingers and chalk from the side of your thumb. You rub carefully around the nails, because clothwork finds every small place in the hand. This rule made sense beyond the factory. A worker's hands entered the home before the rest of him seemed to. They touched the latch, the table, the bread, a child's shoulder, a chair back, a blanket lifted from a peg. The room where cloth was finished did not end at the door if it travelled home on the skin. So washing was a boundary, imperfect, but real. It said the day's labour had marked you, and now you could give some of that mark back to the basin before stepping into the evening. There is tenderness in the tired hand under cold water. It has done more than it can explain. It has judged dampness, held edges, set hooks, felt strain, tied tags, lifted bundles, and steadied a broom. It has known when to pull and when to stop. If you hold your own hand still for a moment, listening in the dark, you may feel how much memory can live in fingers without needing words. The tenterman dries his hands on a rough cloth, and the skin catches slightly against the weave. By now, the factory's day is almost closed around him, though other rooms may still breathe with late work, and the city outside waits with its lamps blurred by mist. He puts on the coat that was kept from the cloth. He takes what remains of his bread, if anything remains, and perhaps a small tin or folded rag from the shelf. The rule has followed him from the first damp length to this last washing, not as a chain, but as a series of quiet handrails. Each one helped him cross the day, and as he steps into the evening air of Ghent, with the smell of canals and coal smoke rising to meet him, we follow not away from the work, but deeper into what those rules meant for the people who lived by them. The evening air has a different kind of dampness from the finishing room, broader and less obedient, and you feel it settle on the face like a cloth laid gently over warm skin. In 1890s Ghent, the tenterman carries the day home through streets that know the same fibres, the same wages, the same smoke, and the same patient traffic of carts, boots, rivercraft and factory bells. The rules do not stay behind him as written orders or foreman's phrases. They travel in the way he avoids a puddle, in the way he keeps his hands close against the cold, and in the way his eyes notice whether a neighbour's wash has been hung too tightly across a yard. You can imagine him passing brick walls darkened by weather, small windows showing lamplight, and doorways where the smell of soup, coal, wet wool, and cabbage meets the canal air. The city sounds softer after the frames, though it is not silent. A horse shifts its weight near a cart. A child calls once and is answered. Somewhere, a woman beats dust from a mat with steady, practical blows. The tenterman hears these things without making a story of them, because after a day of listening for hooks, tiers, rails, and fibre, the ear keeps working even when the shift has ended. One of the oddest rules, and one that reaches beyond the room, is that a man who handles cloth should not pretend his work is invisible. Not in pride exactly, and not in complaint, but in the simple recognition that every finished piece carries many small decisions hidden inside its smoothness. When you walk home beside him, you begin to understand why this mattered. A shirt in a shop window may look like cloth and cutting. A household sheet may look like laundering and folding. Yet somewhere before that there was the damp frame, the measured breadth, the stopped hand, the hook placed only at the edge. This is how industrial work can disappear, even while it fills a city. The mill chimney is visible. The warehouse is visible. The merchant's sign is visible. But the rule followed at 5 a.m. by one cold-handed worker is not visible, though it may be the reason a seam later hangs straight. The Ghent tenterman lives with that vanishing. He does not need applause from the cloth. He needs only the quiet assurance that when it left his hands, it was truer than when it arrived. There is a softness in that thought, especially now as your own breathing slows with the imagined walk. The street does not ask for much. It lets the worker pass. It gives him the wet gleam of stones, the low shapes of roofs, the thin smell of smoke caught under mist, and the familiar pressure of the evening meal waiting somewhere ahead. The rules have made sense all day because they were never really strange. They were ways of being careful in a world where care was easily lost. As the night settles more fully over Ghent and the worker reaches the smaller streets near home, we stay with the habits that remain in the body after the frame is out of sight. At home, the tenterman may not speak at once about cloth, because a household has its own weather and its own rules, and every room receives a tired worker differently. You step into a narrow space where the air is warmer than the street, with steam near the stove, damp coats on pegs, the smell of bread crust, coal, boiled potatoes, and soap. A chair scrapes gently. Someone makes room at the table. The day's noise, which seemed to belong to the factory, now lingers in the shoulders and hands, and the body takes time to learn that it may sit. One rule that made sense, though perhaps no one named it, was that the first minutes after work should be allowed to loosen slowly. A man who had spent hours keeping cloth under correct tension could not always set his own tension down at the door. His hands might still twitch towards straightening an edge on the tablecloth, or smoothing a sleeve, or pulling a drying towel to a better line. You may smile softly at this, because old work often leaves small echoes in ordinary movements. A cooper notices loose hoops. A printer notices crooked letters. A tenter notices cloth that has not been given room to dry. The meal is plain, and its plainness is part of the comfort. There may be soup, bread, potatoes, a little fat, perhaps coffee or chicory, and the steam carries the smell upward into a room that has known many such evenings. If children are present, they may be told not to pull at the worker's sleeve while he eats, and that rule too has the shape of kindness beneath its surface. Not because affection is unwelcome, but because the arm has been lifting, tugging, smoothing, and measuring all day. And even tenderness can arrive too sharply when the muscles are worn. You sit there with him in the quiet that comes after the first hunger has softened. The spoon touches the bowl. A coal shifts in the stove. Rain may begin again outside, tapping the window with a sound not unlike fingers testing cloth for dampness. In 1890s Ghent, many homes were close to labour, close to one another, close to water and industry, and privacy was often thin. Yet within that thinness, small rests could still be protected, just as clean cloth was protected from dirty hands, and the rule of the room became a rule of the evening. Let what is tired settle before asking it to stretch again. This is not a grand comfort. It is the size of a warm bowl and a dry place to sit. It is the size of a sleeve loosened from the wrist, or boots set near the door, or a hand finally held still on the table. The same worker who obeyed the measure at the frame now obeys another measure, quieter still, the measure of enough talk, enough food, enough warmth, enough silence. And if he sleeps early, that too is part of the trade. When the household grows quieter and the day folds inward, we return in thought to the finishing room, because the next morning's rules are already waiting in the dark. Before dawn, a textile room has a deep stillness, not empty, but paused, as if the frames and shelves are holding their breath beneath the night's damp air. The rule says that morning begins with looking before touching, and in 1890s Ghent this made sense because cloth, wood and weather continued their slow conversation while everyone slept. You open the door, and the smell that meets you is familiar but changed. It is cooler now, more closed, with dust settled low, wood dampened by night, and the faint stale trace of yesterday's fibers resting in the air. You do not rush to the first bundle. You let your eyes learn the room again. A pile may have leaned slightly, a tag may have twisted. A frame may show a bead of moisture along the rail. Somewhere, if rain has been persistent, a dark mark may have appeared near a wall where dry boards were expected. The tenterman sees these things because the rule gives him permission to notice before he is swallowed by the day's tasks. It is a rule against blindness, and every busy place needs one. The morning hand is different from the evening hand. It may be stiff from sleep, cold from the walk, and not yet fully joined to the mind. So the rule protects both worker and cloth by slowing the first touch. You rub your fingers together, you breathe into them once, you take in the room's temperature, the sourness of any wet that should not be there, the faint smell of soot if the stove drafted badly, the hush before other workers arrive. The world is not ready simply because the clock says it is ready. A bundle from yesterday may be checked again. Not because yesterday was untrusted, but because night changes things gently and without apology. The folds are opened enough to feel whether warmth or damp has hidden between them. The edge is lifted. The tag is read. If all is well, the cloth continues onward. If not, the problem is still small, and small problems are the kind a patient worker can live with. In that sense, the morning inspection is a kindness sent backward to yesterday's tired self. We can feel how this rule belongs to sleep itself. When you wake in the night, or in the grey hour before dawn, you do not need to leap fully into thought. You may look before touching. You may let the room return to you. You may notice the weight of the blanket, the soft darkness, the coolness near your face, and the slow rhythm of breath before asking anything more of yourself. The old finishing room gives us this lesson without trying to teach, as so many useful places do. And as the first workers arrive with wet shoulders, muffled steps, and voices still low from morning, we move toward the rule about apprenticeship, where the strange habits of the tenter were passed from hand to hand. A new worker in an 1890s Ghent finishing room learns less from speeches than from being watched, corrected, and quietly made to repeat. The rule says that a young or unpracticed hand may not set a full length alone, not because the task is sacred, but because errors in tension often appear too late for easy repair. You stand beside the apprentice as the older tenterman guides his hand toward the selvage. and you feel the embarrassment of being corrected in a room where everyone seems to know the rhythm already. The air is cold. The hook is sharp. The cloth is heavier than expected. The first lessons are small. Do not grab. Do not pull from the middle. Do not trust the eye when the rod is beside you. Do not smooth so hard that you move the weave. Do not talk while counting hooks. The apprentice hears these rules as a cluster of restrictions, but the older worker knows they are really openings into skill. Each rule removes one common way of spoiling the work until what remains is the quiet path the hands can follow. You can smell the apprentice's nervousness almost as part of the room, mixed with damp cotton, coal smoke, young sweat, and the metal tang of hooks handled too tightly. His fingers may be clumsy from cold, and when he sets one hook badly, the older tenterman does not need to raise his voice. He simply lifts the edge, shows the small pucker forming around the bite, and lets the fault explain itself. The best correction in such work is often visible. It hangs there in the cloth, plain and patient, waiting for the eye to learn. This rule made sense because textile finishing was full of knowledge too slight for written instructions. How much resistance should the edge give? How damp is too damp? How a good corner feels between thumb and finger? How the room smells when drying is going too slowly? These things can be described, but description only brings you to the door. The hand must enter. The apprentice must touch, fail a little, correct, and try again under the watch of someone whose own early mistakes have become quiet judgment. There is tenderness in this, though it may not look tender. The older worker protects the cloth, but he also protects the young worker from the larger shame of ruining a piece alone. By standing near him, he lends not only knowledge, but courage. We can feel that steadiness across the years, the calm presence of someone saying with his posture, not his words, that the rule is not meant to trap you, it is meant to bring you safely into the work. In a noisy industrial century, such hand-to-hand learning remained deeply human. When the apprentice's first edge is set well enough, and the older man gives a small nod, we move to the rule about repair, because not every mistake was disaster if it was met early and gently. In the finishing room, repair begins with the admission that cloth, like people, can be put under strain and still be brought back toward usefulness. The rule in 1890s Ghent says you stop at the first sign of trouble, rather than hiding it beneath speed, because a small distortion can often be eased before it becomes a permanent fault. You see it as a pucker near the selvage, a faint diagonal line, a corner pulling harder than its neighbor, or a slight tear where a hook has bitten at the wrong angle. The rule does not change its tone. The work simply narrows around that place. You come close with the tenterman and feel how his attention gathers. The rest of the cloth waits on the frame, pale and damp in the morning light, while this one small area becomes the whole world for a minute. He may ease 2 hooks free, smooth the threads with the flat of his fingers, and let the fabric relax before catching it again along the proper edge. The sound is tiny. A hook lifts. Fiber settles. Wood creaks as the rail's pressure changes by almost nothing, yet that almost nothing matters. Repair has its own smell, because you are close to the cloth now. You smell the water still inside it, the faint trace of soap or finishing agent, the iron of the hook, the old dust in the frame, and perhaps the worker's sleeve damp from leaning. Your cheek feels the coolness of the fabric. Your eyes follow the weave until it becomes nearly hypnotic. Over and under, a small road of threads, crossing and holding. Nothing about this is dramatic. That is why it works. The rule against pushing through a fault is one of the wisest rules in the room. Speed can make a worker look capable for a moment, but the cloth keeps the account. If you ignore the small wrongness, it travels. If you stop, you lose a little time and save a larger piece. The Ghent tenterman has learned that stopping is not always failure. Sometimes stopping is the most skilled movement of the day, because it shows you have seen what haste wanted you to miss. There is a quiet reflection here, and we can let it drift near without making it too heavy. Many forms of care begin by noticing the first slight pull out of shape. A friendship, a tool, a room, a body, a length of cloth on hooks, all may be easier to tend before strain becomes damage. The tenterman does not turn this into philosophy, but his work embodies it, and the lesson rests in the room like warmth from a stove after the flame has lowered. As the repaired edge settles and the long cloth lies true again, we move into the middle hours, where the rule about monotony shows how repeated work could steady the mind rather than empty it. The middle hours in an 1890s Ghent finishing room do not announce themselves, because they arrive by repetition rather than by event. The rule here is not written on a board, but every experienced tenterman knows it. Keep the body's rhythm steady enough that the mind does not begin inventing shortcuts. You set hooks, check breadth, feel dampness, adjust corners, and move along the frame in a pace that belongs neither to hurry nor idleness. The room becomes familiar in sections. This rail, this bench, this window with a cracked lower pane, this darker patch on the floor where water once stood too long. Monotony can be mistaken for emptiness by those who do not live inside it. But you, walking beside the work, begin to notice how full it is of tiny variations. One cloth clings more than another, one edge curls. One length smells more strongly of washwater. One piece gleams faintly blue in the highlight, while another holds a creamier tone. A rail that moved easily yesterday resists today because dampness has swollen the wood. The task repeats, but it never repeats exactly, and the worker's calm comes from sensing the difference. There is sound enough to keep the mind company. Hooks tick lightly, boards answer feet, cloth whispers when lifted. A distant machine trembles through the wall like weather heard from inside a house. Voices rise and fall without sharpness, and sometimes no one speaks for several minutes because the work has drawn everyone into its own measure. The body learns to conserve itself, letting the larger muscles support the smaller ones, letting breath follow movement, letting attention rest on the next small act instead of wandering too far ahead. This rule made sense because tired minds become unsafe when they are either rushed or starved of attention. Too much pressure makes mistakes. Too little engagement makes the hands careless. The old tenter's rhythm lives between those errors. You keep enough awareness to feel the cloth's answer and enough calm to repeat the motion without resentment. In that balance, there is something soothing, something almost like the rocking of a boat in narrow water, not asleep, not fully awake, but carried by the steady pattern of necessary things. We may rest in that rhythm for a while. The Ghent room breathes around us. Damp cloth dries by degrees, light changes on the hooks, a worker clears his throat, another shifts his weight, and the morning's chill slowly becomes the warmer heaviness of a room filled with labor. The rule about monotony is simply this: do not fight the repeated thing. Enter it gently and let its small changes keep you company. When the repeated motions have filled the long middle of the day and the windows begin to show a milder afternoon brightness, we come to the rule about inspection by light. A cloth may look, sound in dimness, and show its secrets when light crosses it properly, which is why the Ghent tenterman does not trust one glance from one angle. The rule says that inspection must follow the light, and in 1890s Ghent, where smoke, fog, and narrow windows made light a working material of its own, this was more sensible than it may sound. You stand at the side of the frame and let the pale daylight slide across the drying surface. It reveals raised threads, uneven patches, tiny shadows near hooks, and places where moisture remains hidden in the weave. The worker does not stare harshly, he lets his eyes travel. Sometimes he bends. Sometimes he steps back. Sometimes he lifts the lower edge enough to see how the cloth hangs under its own weight. The room smells warmer now, and the cloth gives off less sour dampness as it dries. Dust turns in the light near the window. Outside, if the pane is clear enough, you may see the blurred shape of a roofline, the passing shadow of smoke, or the faint movement of someone crossing the yard with a bundle held against the chest. Inspection by light protects honesty in a way touch alone cannot. The hand knows tension, dampness, thickness, and resistance, but the eye knows shadow, sheen, direction, and the little difference between a crease that will fall out and a crease that has begun to settle. The strange rule becomes obvious when you see the cloth awaken under the angled light, showing what it hid when viewed straight on. No one sense is enough. The work asks several senses to speak together, and the tenterman has learned to hear their quiet agreement. There is an art in choosing when to inspect. Too early and the wet surface may shine so much that everything looks smoother than it is. Too late, and a flaw may have set itself stubbornly into place. So you wait for the moment when the cloth is neither too wet nor fully dry, when it still accepts correction, and when the light finds texture without exaggerating it. That moment may last only a short time on a cloudy day, which is why the worker watches the window as carefully as the frame. This, too, is a rule about attention without force. You cannot make light better by wanting it. You can only meet it when it arrives. In the finishing room, this gives the day a quiet dependence on sky and season, even within industrial walls. Ghent's clouds, smoke, fog, and low northern light enter the work through glass, and the tenterman receives them as part of his trade. The city outside and the cloth inside are not separate after all. They touch each other in the beam that shows a flaw, and when the light has done its gentle revealing and the cloth has been corrected where correction is still possible, we follow the afternoon toward the rule about neighbors in the trade. Neighbors in the trade are not always neighbors by address, though in 1890s Ghent they may live close enough to hear one another's doors at dawn. They are the washers, bleachers, dyers, calendarers, packers, carters, clerks, and warehouse hands whose work touches the same piece before and after the tenter frame. The rule says you do not curse another trade too quickly, because cloth carries many histories, and the fault in your hand may have begun 3 rooms away, 3 days ago, under different light and different pressure. This rule sounds generous, but it is also practical, because blame wastes time when the cloth still needs care. You learn to read a mark without immediately naming a culprit. A yellowish shadow may come from water, storage, a dirty roller, an earlier fold, or a careless hand you will never meet. A wavering edge may be the weaver's trouble, the washer's trouble, the tenter's trouble, or only the nature of a stubborn piece passing through damp weather. The Ghent tenterman may have opinions, certainly, and workers have always had opinions in warm corners and near cooling stoves, but the rule asks him to look before speaking. It keeps the room from becoming sharper than it needs to be. There is a smell to this shared world, a layered smell that no single trade owns. From one doorway comes soap and hot water. From another comes dye, sour and mineral. From the yard comes horse sweat, rope, wet straw, and the tarry breath of cartwheels after rain. Inside the finishing room, these traces settle lightly onto the air, and you begin to feel how the cloth's journey through Ghent is almost like a canal route, passing lock after lock, each one lowering or lifting it by a small exact measure. The rule made sense because a finishing house was a place of handoffs. One worker's end was another worker's beginning. A rough remark could sour a necessary exchange, while a clear note or quiet question could save a length from further harm. If the tenterman saw a recurring flaw, he might tell the foreman or speak to the worker before him, but the good rule was to speak with the evidence in hand. Cloth was better than gossip. A visible crease, a measured shrinkage, a repeated stain near the same edge. These things could talk steadily when tired people could not. There is comfort in imagining such practical fairness. It does not make the world soft, and it does not remove hard wages, long hours, or the pressures of trade. But within the narrow reach of one day's work, it allows people to handle one another with a little more patience. You may not know the washer's whole morning, or the dyer's trouble with a bad vat, or the carter's delay in rain, and so you begin where you are, with the cloth before you, the mark beneath your finger. And the rule that says understanding is often slower than accusation. When that understanding has settled like dust in a quiet beam of light, we move toward the rule about tools, because a shared room depends on small belongings returning to their proper places. The tools of the tenterman in 1890s Ghent are not grand instruments, but they are intimate, and each one carries the feel of a particular motion. A rod, a wedge, a mallet, a knife for twine, a rag for hands, a pencil, a hook gauge, or a small tool for straightening bent pins may look ordinary on the bench. The rule says that a tool borrowed must be returned where it was found, and if it is damaged, the damage must be named before the next hand reaches for it. This is not merely politeness. It is how the room keeps its rhythm. You can feel the irritation of a missing tool without anyone needing to raise a voice. The cloth is ready, the edge is damp enough. The light is right. Then the measuring rod is gone, or the good wedge has been left near another frame. or the knife has dulled because someone used it against wire instead of string. A small absence widens quickly. The worker's body pauses. The cloth waits in the wrong state. The moment stretches thin. In such a place, returning a tool is a form of kindness towards someone's future patience. The bench itself is a quiet map of habit. The rod lies along the back. The chalk rests near the board. The rag hangs from a peg where it can dry without touching clean cloth. The mallet sits heavy and dark, with dents on its head and a handle polished by many grips. When you lift it, there is a pleasant bluntness in the weight, enough to settle a wedge, but not so much that the hand forgets delicacy. Every object has learned the shape of use. The rule made sense, especially in a room where time mattered without ever needing to become frantic. A worker who searches for a tool loses more than minutes. He loses the unbroken line of attention that lets him feel the cloth accurately. He may return annoyed, and annoyance is a poor companion for fine adjustment. It pulls too hard. It misses small warnings. It turns the next motion rough. So the old rule guards the worker's temper as much as the tool itself. You may notice how many sensible rules are really rules for protecting attention. Put the tool back. Mark the cloth. Speak softly during counting. Inspect under light. Wash before touching. Let the wet piece settle. None of these sounds noble alone, yet together they make a room where carefulness has fewer obstacles. The Ghent tenterman may never describe it in such words, but his hands know the relief of reaching for what should be there and finding it waiting. And when the tools rest again in their familiar places, the day carries us toward the rule about edges that fray, where the cloth shows its small impatience most clearly. A fraying edge has a soft, untidy look, like a thought coming apart before it reaches speech, and the tenterman notices it as soon as light catches the loose threads. In 1890s Ghent, the rule says that fray must be controlled early, never ignored because it lies at the side and not in the handsome middle. You stand with him and see how a few wandering threads can catch on hooks, twist under tension, or make the selvage behave unevenly along the frame. The edge is where the cloth meets handling, and edges, in work as in life, often bear the roughest news. The sound of a fraying thread being drawn free is very small. It may whisper between finger and thumb. It may break with a soft tick. The tenterman may trim it, tuck it, or adjust the hook placement so it does not travel deeper into the weave. There is a smell of damp fiber close to your face, and a little coldness comes off the cloth as you lean near. The loose threads cling to cracked skin, and when they fall, they curl on the dark board like pale hairs. The rule made sense because damage loves permission. A loose thread that catches once may catch again, and each catch invites a larger pull. If you ignore it because the center looks smooth, you may later find that the edge has weakened beyond easy saving. But if you tend it early, the cloth can continue its ordinary journey without much fuss. This is the quiet genius of the finishing room, where many rescues are so small that no one outside the trade would recognize them as rescues. There is also honesty in caring for the edge. The customer may first see the broad surface, but the maker and finisher know that edges reveal how a thing has been treated. A good edge tells of careful weaving, careful washing, careful drying, and careful hands along the way. A neglected edge tells another story, so the Ghent tenterman gives time to the side of the cloth, not because it is decorative, but because strength often lives where attention is least expected. You can let that thought become sleepy and simple. The side matters, the border matters, the place that seems only there to hold the middle is part of the whole. The old rule understood this without poetry, and perhaps that is why it feels trustworthy. It comes not from ornament, but from use. As the loose threads are cleared and the selvage lies neater against the hooks, we move toward the rule about heat, where comfort for the worker and safety for the cloth had to be held in careful balance. Heat in the finishing room is never only warmth, because heat changes drying, changes tension, changes air, and changes the tired temper of everyone standing near the frames. In 1890s Ghent, especially in cold months when dampness lived deep in brick and wood, the rule says the stove may warm the room, but must not drive the cloth too quickly. This seems easy until your fingers are aching, your breath is pale, and the thought of more heat feels like mercy. A worker's body wants the stove, while the cloth may need restraint. You can see the stove in a corner or against a wall, practical and dark, with a pipe that carries smoke imperfectly away. It gives off a smell of coal, hot iron, ash, and sometimes a little sulky smoke when the draft is wrong. Near it, boots dry faster and hands thaw more readily. But cloth hung too close may lose moisture unevenly, drying at the edge before the center has had time to settle. The warm air rises, drifts, and pockets beneath beams, while the lower parts of the room stay cooler. The rule made sense because drying is not merely the absence of wet. It is a process, and processes have tempers. Too much heat can fix a crease, harden a distortion, or make fibers contract unevenly after they have been persuaded into shape. Too little heat leaves cloth heavy, sour-smelling, and slow, inviting mildew or delay. The tenter man learns to judge the stove not by comfort alone, but by what the cloth says under his hand. Is it drying from one side too quickly? Does the surface feel warm while the fold remains cool? Does the smell change from clean dampness to something stale? There is a human negotiation here that feels familiar. You may want ease sooner than the work can safely allow. You may want warmth, speed, closure, and the simple pleasure of feeling your fingers again. Yet the rule asks you to share the room with the thing you are tending. It is not only your cold that matters, and not only the cloth's perfection. The day must be arranged so both can continue, worker and fabric, body and task, each making claims that are real. The Ghent tenter man may step near the stove for a moment, rubbing his hands slowly, then return before comfort turns into delay. He listens to the faint breathing of heat through the room. He watches where steam fades fastest. He shifts a piece if the warmth is too direct. The stove remains a friend, but not a master, and that distinction is one more rule the hands remember. When the fire has been fed, and the cloth kept safely from its eagerness, we follow the warmth upward toward the rafters, where air itself becomes part of the trade. Air in a tenter room must move but not rush, and that is one of the rules that seems almost impossible until you have stood among drying cloth for several seasons. In 1890s Ghent, the rule says windows, vents, and doors are opened by judgment, not habit, because a fine drying breeze at 1 hour may become a dirty draft at the next. You feel this as the worker feels it, on the cheek first, then on the wrist, then in the cloth's edge as it trembles slightly against the hook. Air is invisible work, and the tenter man learns to employ it carefully. A high window may be opened with a pole, its hinge complaining softly after damp nights. A vent may be shifted. A door to the yard may be held ajar only as long as needed. The incoming air smells of Ghent's streets, carrying canal damp, smoke, rain on stone, and sometimes the earthy scent of market carts passing beyond the yard. Inside, the older air is warmer, fibrous, and close. When the two meet, you can almost feel the room adjusting its shoulders. The rule made sense because drying cloth is a conversation between fiber and atmosphere. Still air leaves moisture lingering in the weave. Harsh air pulls unevenly and may carry grit. Air from a smoky yard can stain or dull what washing has just made clean. Air from a wet passage only pretends to help. So the tenter man reads movement as carefully as breadth, asking not whether the room feels pleasant, but whether the cloth is being invited toward evenness. There is a sound to good air, though it is barely sound at all. It is the softest lift at a hanging edge, the almost silent loosening of dampness, the faint shifting of lint along the boards. Bad air has a louder nature, rattling a loose pane, slapping cloth against hooks, or bringing in a smell that makes workers look up with the same displeased patience. You begin to hear these differences as the day lengthens, and the room's quiet becomes less empty, more full of signs. A worker who controls air gently has accepted that not every useful force can be grasped in the hand. Some things must be guided by opening and closing, waiting and adjusting, noticing and stopping. The rule is not mysterious. It is only weather-made local. It takes the whole sky over Ghent and reduces it to a narrow decision about one window, one frame, one damp length of cloth, and one patient worker who has learned that the unseen can still pull hard. And as the air steadies and the cloth settles into its measured drying, we come to the rule about silence after a mistake. where the room gives a worker time to recover his hands. A mistake in the tenter room seldom needs a trumpet, because the cloth itself announces enough, and in 1890s Ghent the older workers understand this. The rule says that after a small mistake, no one crowds the hand that made it, and no one fills the air with sharp remarks while the worker is trying to undo what can still be undone. You feel the rule shift slightly when a hook takes the wrong bite, or a corner pulls out of square, or a thread gives that small unhappy sound. Then the voice is lower, space opens around the frame. This rule is not sentimental. It is practical kindness, which is often the strongest kind. A flustered worker pulls too quickly. A shamed worker hides the next fault. A man who is mocked may look at his neighbors instead of looking at the cloth, and in that one distracted moment the small damage may deepen. So the Ghent tenterman bends toward the trouble, perhaps with an older hand beside him but not over him, and the room allows repair to have its quiet. You can hear the difference. The ordinary murmur pauses, but not dramatically. A boot shifts on the boards. Someone clears his throat near the stove. A rail creaks as tension is eased, and the worker's breath becomes audible for a moment because everyone has stopped speaking over it. The cloth smells cold and wet where it has been lifted from the frame, and the loosened edge lies against the wrist with the faint heaviness of something not yet spoiled, only asking to be treated carefully. A good rule knows the difference between correction and punishment. Correction brings the hand back to the work. Punishment often sends the mind away from it. In a room where wages, pride, and material cost are all braided together, the temptation to snap at a mistake must have been strong, especially on days when orders were late and damp weather had slowed every piece. Yet the sensible practice was to let the worker see, stop, ease, and reset before words hardened around him. There is a gentle universality in this, and it drifts toward the listener like warm air from an old stove. We all know the moment after a small error when the heart jumps and the hand forgets how light it can be. The rule from the Ghent tenter room says, in its plain working way, let the person come back to himself. Let the fibers relax. Let the breath settle. Then the correction may be smaller than the fear that first rose around it. When the cloth is mended as far as it can be, and the room's low murmur returns, we move toward the rule about shared light at day's end. Lake light in the finishing room is a limited resource, and in 1890s, Ghent, before bright electric certainty became ordinary in every workspace, the rule says that no worker should block another's useful light. It sounds almost childlike when spoken plainly, yet it belongs to the serious order of the room. You stand near the frame and see how one body, one hanging coat, one carelessly placed bundle, or one shifted screen can cast a shadow exactly where another hand is trying to judge a crease. In that dimness, cloth lies. The light enters through high panes that may be fogged, dirty, cracked, or filmed with the city's coal breath. It falls unevenly across wood, hooks, damp cloth, and the pale lint gathered along corners. As afternoon lowers, workers begin to know which places remain trustworthy and which become dull too early. Someone moves half a step aside without being asked. Someone shifts a bundle away from the bench. A younger worker learns not to stand with his shoulder between the window and a man checking the edge. The rule is small, and it is also social. You can smell evening before it arrives fully. The stove smoke thickens as the air cools. Wet coats near the doorway give off their woolly dampness. Cloth that has nearly dried smells cleaner, less sour, as if the room has been slowly rinsed by its own labor. Outside, the yard loses shape. Inside, the light becomes golden in one strip and grey everywhere else, and the tenterman uses that strip with the care of someone spending the last coins in a purse. The rule about shared light made sense because inspection was not only private skill. It depended on common arrangement. A worker might have good eyes and careful hands, yet still fail if another person unknowingly took away the angle he needed. In such a room, courtesy becomes part of production, not because factory owners wrote it prettily in a ledger, but because workers learned by irritation and repair that bodies must make room for one another's seeing. There is quiet beauty in that. To give someone light is not grand. It may be only the movement of a shoulder, the lifting of a basket, the choice not to stand in a doorway, yet it allows another person to finish well. The Ghent tenterman may not thank every such movement, and the giver may not expect thanks, because the room runs on hundreds of unspoken allowances like this. They are almost invisible, but they hold the day together as surely as threads hold the cloth. As the last useful daylight thins across the frames and lamps begin to matter more than windows, we follow the rule about flame, soot, and keeping light from becoming dirt. A lamp is helpful and dangerous in a textile room, not in a dramatic sense, but in the plain daily way that flame, smoke, and pale cloth do not naturally belong together. In 1890s Ghent, the rule says lamps must be trimmed, placed, and watched so that their soot does not drift onto clean work and their heat does not trouble cloth that is still finishing its slow drying. You see the lamp not as an ornament, but as another tool with a temper. Its glass must be clean, its wick must be right. Its smoke must be noticed before it writes itself on the fabric. The smell of lamp oil has a particular evening character. It is sharp and soft at once, mingling with coal smoke, damp cotton, warm dust, and the tired smell of wool coats. When the lamp is adjusted well, the flame steadies under glass, and the light pools on the bench without breathing blackness upward. When it is neglected, the flame lengthens, trembles, and begins to smoke, making a faint, dark tongue that every cloth worker distrusts. The rule exists because a nearly invisible stain can become obvious later under shop light or household sun. You hold the lamp low enough to see, but not so close that it warms one patch of cloth more than another. You keep it away from loose lint. You do not carry it carelessly under hanging lengths where soot may kiss the underside. The tenterman has done this so often that the movement seems casual, but it is a practiced casualness, like a cook lifting a pot without measuring the heat allowed. His hand knows the safe distance. His nose knows when the wick has gone wrong. This rule made sense in a world where illumination was not clean by default. Light had substance. It burned something, consumed something, and left traces behind. To work by lamp was to accept help from a small, controlled impurity, and the worker's job was to keep that impurity from crossing into the cloth. The modern eye may think of light as weightless, but in the Ghent finishing room, light had smell, heat, smoke, and maintenance. It asked to be tended before it could help anyone see. There is a soothing little ritual in lamp trimming. The glass is lifted, the wick is cut or turned, a smudge is wiped away, the flame returns smaller and steadier, and the room resumes its low confidence. The rule does not ban the lamp, it teaches companionship with it. Use what helps, but know its cost. Keep the flame calm, and it will let the last work of evening be done without leaving its own dark signature. When the lamps burn cleanly and the shadows settle into their corners, we come to the rule about the final measure, the one taken when the cloth has finished arguing with air. The final measure is not a repetition of the first one, though it may use the same rod and the same quiet hand. In 1890s Ghent, the rule says that cloth is measured after drying, not only while being set, because the first measure is an intention, and the last measure is the answer. You stand beside the finished length as it lies or hangs ready for folding, and the room has the hushed feeling of a question nearly complete. Has the breadth held? Has the edge stayed true? Has the cloth returned honestly from wetness into its usable state? The rod touches the cloth with a soft tap. Fingers smooth, but do not stretch. The worker's head bends, and the lamplight finds the pale line of the edge. There is no need for drama if the measure is right. A small nod may be all. If it is wrong, the room does not fall apart. The note is made, the piece is judged as it is. Yet you can feel the satisfaction of a proper final measure, because it confirms not one motion, but the whole chain of choices made since morning. This rule made sense because cloth changes as it dries, and any worker who pretends otherwise is only fooling the ledger for a little while. Wet breadth is not dry breadth. Tension under hooks is not the same as relaxed width on the table. A piece that looked obedient on the frame may draw inward after release, especially if it was forced too far or dried too quickly. The final measure respects the cloth's last word. It does not argue with it. It records it. There is humility in measuring twice. It admits that the first act was not enough by itself. It allows reality to return after effort, and it asks the worker to look at the outcome rather than the intention. The Ghent tenterman may have wanted the piece to hold. He may have done everything his experience advised. Still, he brings the rod again, because wanting and knowing are different things, and the rule keeps them from being confused. You might feel, as you listen, how restful that distinction can be. Many days are full of intentions set carefully at the beginning and answers that arrive only later. The old Tenta rule says we can meet the answer gently, measure it, learn from it, and fold it into the next day's work. There is no need to startle the night with blame. There is only the rod, the edge, the mark, and the quiet acceptance of what the cloth has become. When the final measure is written and the finished length is folded into its proper place, we turn toward the rule about not wasting the offcuts and thread ends that gather at the margins of work. The smallest scraps in a textile room may look like nothing, yet in 1890s Ghent nothing with fibre in it was entirely without use. The rule says that clean thread ends, offcuts, tying string, and usable rags must be sorted from true dirt, because waste has grades, and a careful room knows the difference. You watch the worker separate a pale thread from gritty sweepings, a decent rag from one stained with oil, a length of twine long enough for another bundle from the limp knots that have earned disposal. It is not miserly. It is material intelligence. The textures are varied under the hand. Thread ends cling and tickle. Old twine is dry and hairy. A clean rag folds softly, while an oily one has a darker weight and a smell that does not belong near pale cloth. Lint gathers in soft clumps, light enough to drift when breathed upon, but troublesome enough to catch fire if left near flame. The basket for useful scraps may be rough willow or wood, placed where hands can reach it without crossing the clean work. Everything has its place because everything has a possible future, even if that future is only wiping a rail. The rule made sense in a working city where margins were narrow. Materials cost money, time cost strength. A good rag saved a better cloth from being used badly. A recovered string tied a small bundle. A bit of clean waste might serve for padding, wiping, or testing moisture. To sort scraps was not beneath the skilled worker, because skill includes knowing what may be used again and what must leave the room. Carelessness wastes twice, first when it throws away the useful, and again when it lets the dirty remain among the clean. There is a calm economy in this action. No one speaks grandly of thrift while doing it. The hand simply knows which pile receives which piece. In that ordinary sorting, you see a whole world that handled things more slowly because things were harder to replace. A rag was not merely a rag. It was a future wipe, a softened grip, a quick rescue for a wet mark, or the difference between using a sleeve and keeping the sleeve clean. This rule also keeps the room morally even, in the modest sense of not pretending that usefulness ends where neatness begins. The clean scrap is honored by being saved. The dirty scrap is honored by being removed. Both decisions protect the work. The Ghent Tenterman bends, sorts, and rises again, and the day becomes a little more orderly, not because everything has been made new, but because each remnant has been understood for what it is. As the scrap basket is set aside and the true dirt is carried away, we move toward the rule about the foreman's inspection, where authority enters the room but does not replace the worker's own eye. A foreman in an 1890s Ghent finishing house may be fair, difficult, hurried, weary, proud, or all of these in 1 week, but the rule of inspection remains. The cloth should be ready to speak for itself before he arrives. You do not tidy only what he will see. You do not conceal a doubtful edge behind a better fold. You do not hope the dim light will do the work of honesty. The Tenterman prepares the piece as if no one were coming, and because someone is coming, that preparation matters even more. Footsteps announce authority long before words do. A heavier tread on the boards, a pause near the door, the clearing of a throat. Perhaps the faint smell of outside air follows the foreman in, along with tobacco, damp wool, or the sharper scent of ink from an office. The worker's hands may continue moving, but attention shifts. The room becomes aware of itself. A fold is straightened. A tag lies visible. The measuring rod is near enough to answer questions. The rule made sense because inspection built a bridge between handwork and commercial trust. The foreman could not watch every hook being set, and the merchant could not feel every damp edge as it dried, so the finished piece had to carry evidence of care. A clear tag, a truthful ledger, a square fold, an even breadth, and a visible note about any flaw allowed the work to pass onward without each person beginning from suspicion. The worker's own discipline made the inspection less harsh. There is tension in such moments, but not the kind that wakes the room into drama. It is the low tension of being seen after labor. The Ghent tenterman may feel a small tightening in the chest when the foreman bends over a corner or rubs the cloth lightly between finger and thumb. He knows what is good. He knows what is imperfect. He knows when a criticism is fair and when it is merely weather speaking through a man with a schedule. Still, the rule steadies him. The cloth is as ready as he could make it. If approval comes, it may be brief. If correction comes, it may be added to tomorrow's care. Either way, the work continues. The old room does not exist for praise, though praise may warm it for a moment. It exists for repeated trust, earned in small increments and measured across countless lengths of cloth. We stand beside the worker and feel how inspection, when met with honest preparation, becomes less like judgment and more like the next station in the cloth's long route through the city. When the foreman has passed on and the room releases the breath it did not know it held, we follow the finished cloth toward packing, where the rule about folding away from damp walls becomes suddenly sensible. A folded length placed near the wrong wall may take on more from the building than anyone intended, and in Ghent the walls have always been willing to share their dampness. The rule says finished cloth must be kept off cold brick, away from sweating stone, and above the floor, even if the room is crowded and the shelf seems inconveniently far. You carry the bundle with the tenterman and feel its dry weight against your arms, cleaner now, more settled, carrying the faint scent of the room it has survived. The wall beside you looks solid, but touch it and the fingertips come away cool. This is one of those rules that belongs entirely to lived experience. A wall may look harmless in lamplight. A floor may look dry after sweeping, yet cloth left too close through a wet night can gather a shadow of moisture, a smell, or a faint mark that appears later as if by accusation. The worker learns the building's moods. This corner sweats in east wind. That shelf stays safe. The lower boards near the canal side are never to be trusted after long rain. Architecture becomes part of the trade. The senses gather round this knowledge. Cold brick smells mineral and old. Damp wood gives off a dull, enclosed scent, almost like a cellar. Dry shelving has a quieter smell, dusty, but not sour. When you place the bundle down, the surface beneath it matters. A little space below allows air to move. A strip of wood between cloth and wall may save the piece from a night's slow harm. These are not elegant solutions, but they are wise in the way old working rooms are wise. The rule made sense, because finished work is most painful to spoil. At the beginning of a process, a fault may be expected, corrected, or absorbed into later labor. At the end, there is less room left for rescue, so the Ghent tenterman is careful precisely when tiredness tells him the day is over. He does not let the wall undo the frame. He does not let a damp floor write the final mark after hooks, measuring, drying, and folding have all done their part. There is a tender lesson in guarding what is nearly complete. Many things become vulnerable at the moment we think we may stop caring for them. The cloth on the shelf, the cooling bread, the banked fire, the sleeping child, the mended tool, each asks for one last right placement before being left alone. The old tenter rule understands this without softness of language. Keep it from the damp wall. Give it air. Let it rest where the night cannot creep into it. And when the packed lengths are safe from wall and floor, we turn toward the rule about leaving notes for the morning shift. Because some forms of care are meant for people we may not see. A note left for the morning shift is a small act of trust, and in 1890s Ghent, it may be written in pencil on a scrap, chalked near the board, or spoken to the last man still tying his apron. The rule says that anything the next hands must know should be left plainly, because the night will erase tone, context, and the tired little gestures that made a warning clear. You may think you will remember to tell someone at dawn, but dawn has its own cold confusion. A note waits better than memory. You stand near the bench while the tenterman writes slowly, perhaps with a pencil kept short by many sharpenings, its point leaving a grey line on rough paper. The message is not graceful, and it does not need to be. North frame swollen near lower rail. Third bundle still cool inside. Check hooks by window after rain. Such words are ordinary, almost bare, but they carry a whole worker's evening into another worker's morning, without requiring both men to meet in the doorway. The room around the note feels nearly asleep. The lamp flame is steady now. The smell of oil has softened. Cloth rests on shelves. Lint lies gathered, and the frames stand with their rows of hooks like quiet teeth no longer biting. Outside, rain may begin again, or mist may simply thicken until the yard disappears into a grey closeness. The note remains on the bench, light enough to lift with one breath, yet useful enough to save a piece from trouble. This rule made sense because industrial time often divided people who still depended on one another. One worker ended what another began. One pair of hands noticed what another pair would need. The note is a way of extending care across absence, and there is something peaceful in that, because it means attention can outlast the body's presence in the room. You may go home, but one useful sentence stays behind: keeping watch. The Ghent tenterman does not call this generosity. He may only call it proper practice, or say nothing at all as he lays the pencil down. Yet the effect is gentle. Tomorrow's worker will enter a room already made slightly kinder by someone else's tired accuracy, and the cloth waiting there will be spared the avoidable harm of ignorance. In a trade built from many small handoffs, that is no small thing. When the note has been left where morning eyes will find it, we follow the work into the older memory of the tenter ground, where outdoor rules still lingered inside the later factory room. Before enclosed rooms and more controlled finishing spaces, the very word tenter called to mind open grounds, frames under sky, and cloth stretched where wind, sun, smoke, and neighbors could all look on. In 1890s Ghent, many processes had become more industrial, yet old habits stayed alive in sayings, gestures, and the caution of workers who knew that cloth had once been finished almost in public. The rule says a piece should look right not only close under the hand, but from a little distance. You step back from the frame and let the whole length answer the eye. From nearby, the cloth is threads, hooks, dampness, and edge. From a distance, it becomes a plane, a pale field, a surface that either rests evenly or shows a slight unease in its fall. The tenterman may stand with his arms loose, head tilted only a little, watching not one flaw but the whole shape of the work. The room smells of wet wood and dust, but in that moment you can almost feel the older outdoor air behind it. The smell of grass, mud, smoke, and weather moving over cloth fields at the edge of town. The rule made sense because closeness can mislead. When you spend too long with one corner, one edge, or one stubborn hook, the eye may forget the whole. A length may measure correctly in places and still look troubled in its general hang. So the worker steps back, not to admire, but to see proportion, fall, and balance. Distance is another tool, as real as a rod or wedge, though easier to forget when the day is crowded. There is calm in stepping back. It gives the hands a rest and lets the body straighten. You may hear your own back answer with a soft ache, and your breathing changes once you are no longer bent over the frame. The cloth, seen whole, seems quieter than it did under the fingers. It becomes possible to sense whether the day's many little corrections have joined into one larger truth. This rule reaches beyond the finishing room without leaving it. We all come too close to our small troubles at times, tracing one thread until the whole fabric of the day disappears. The Ghent tenterman's habit offers a modest remedy. Step back. Let the whole length come into view. See whether the shape is truer than the anxious corner made you think. Then return, if needed, with calmer hands. As the whole cloth settles in the eye, and the older memory of open tenter grounds fades back into brick and lamp glow, we come to the rule about names, because even ordinary cloth needed to know where it belonged. Names in the finishing room may be company names, order names, merchant marks, worker marks, street names, or numbers that function like names when spoken often enough. The rule says that a piece should never be passed onward with a doubtful identity, because a misnamed cloth can travel through the wrong process and be ruined by perfectly competent hands doing the wrong task. In 1890s Ghent, where orders might move between rooms and firms with practical speed, this rule had the quiet strength of a locked gate. It kept one thing from becoming confused with another. You watched the tag being checked against the ledger, and the act seems simple until you imagine the consequences of haste. A piece meant for light finishing might be pressed too hard. A cloth ordered to one breadth might be measured against another. A merchant waiting for a particular lot might receive a near cousin that looks similar in the dim warehouse, but behaves differently under cutting. The cloth itself cannot speak its destination, the tag must speak for it. There is a papery smell to this part of the work, mixed with string, dust, pencil lead, and the cleaner scent of folded textiles. The tag edges are slightly rough. Ink may have blurred where damp fingers touched it. A string knots around the bundle with a dry rasp, and when it is pulled snug, the tag lies flat against the cloth like a small passport. You feel how vulnerable such a simple thing is, and how much practical faith is placed in it. The rule made sense because factories and finishing houses are full of almost similar things. Similar cloths, similar bundles, similar shelves, similar markings, similar tired workers moving through similar hours. Without clear names, similarity becomes a trap. With clear names, the work can flow. The old room does not need confusion to be mysterious. It has enough mystery already in dampness, fiber, weather, and the changing temper of woven threads. There is comfort in being rightly named, even for cloth. A thing with its proper mark can go where it should. It does not need to be guessed at by every hand it meets. The Ghent Tenterman understands this in a practical way, and his care with tags reminds us that identity is often maintained by humble acts. A tied string, a chalk line, a ledger entry, a worker pausing just long enough to read before lifting. When the names have been checked and the bundles rest with their small tags facing outward, we turn toward the rule about pace, the one that kept speed from becoming waste. Pace is one of the harder rules to teach, because it cannot be measured only by the clock, and in 1890s Ghent it lived between the demands of production and the stubborn facts of cloth. The rule says that a tenterman should work as fast as the piece safely allows, which is both perfectly clear and impossible to understand until your hands have followed enough wet edges. You cannot simply decide to be quick. The cloth gives permission, or withholds it. Some pieces invite steady speed. The selvage is strong, the dampness even, the breadth familiar, and the frame in good order. Your hands move with a satisfying continuity, and the hooks seem to arrive beneath your fingers almost before you seek them. Other pieces slow the whole body. They curl, cling, fray, pull diagonally, or carry a hidden unevenness from earlier handling. To force them into the pace of easier cloth is not efficiency. It is impatience wearing a useful mask. The room teaches pace through sound and resistance. A clean rhythm has a low music hook, smooth measure shift, with no sharp interruption and no breath held too long. A wrong pace begins to sound jagged. Hooks scrape, the rail knocks. Cloth snaps faintly where it should whisper. The worker's boots move too often, or not enough. Even the smell of the room can seem sharper when haste enters it, because warm bodies and damp cloth respond to pressure in ways the mind may notice only after the hands already know. This rule made sense because production records might count pieces, but damaged pieces counted too. A day made faster by rough handling could become slower in repair, argument, reworking, or loss. The best pace was not the slowest possible pace, and it was not the fastest visible pace. It was the pace at which skill, material, and weather could travel together without pulling one another crooked. The Ghent Tenterman learns this pace as a walker learns a familiar street in rain. There is a sleepy steadiness in that idea. You need not hurry beyond the conditions of the moment. You need not prove calm by moving too slowly either. You may find the pace that lets the work remain true, and once found, you may return to it again and again, as breath returns to the body after a sigh. The rule is not soft in the sense of easy. It is soft in the sense of wise pressure. As the pace finds its proper rhythm, and the room moves without the rough edges of hurry, we come to the rule about winter hands, when cold made every small motion more difficult. Winter in Ghent enters through doors, walls, windows, and the worker's bones, and a finishing room can be damp cold even when a stove is doing its honest best. The rule says that cold hands must be warmed before setting delicate edges, not for comfort alone, but because numb fingers lie to their owner. You may believe you are touching lightly when you are pressing hard. You may think a thread feels sound when you cannot feel it at all. The cloth does not forgive the hand simply because the hand is cold. The tenter man rubs his palms together near the stove, slowly enough not to crack chilled skin further. He may breathe into cupped fingers, flex them, or hold them near but not too near the heat, because sudden warmth can hurt almost as much as cold. The smell of winter work is thick and close. Coal smoke, wet wool, damp shoes, raw cotton, and the metallic tang that seems to rise from iron hooks in cold air. Your fingers ache in sympathy as they begin to wake. The rule made sense because touch was one of the main instruments of the trade. A measuring rod could tell breadth, and light could show a crease. But the hand judged moisture, strain, softness, thickness, and the little warning tremor of threads under tension. Without feeling, the worker was partly blind. To warm the hands was not indulgence. It was sharpening the tool that no one could hang on a peg. Cold also changes patience. A chilled body wants to shorten tasks, to grip hard, to finish the nearest thing and return to warmth. The rule interrupts that impulse. It says, take the moment, bring the hand back to usefulness before you let it speak to the cloth. In a hard season, such rules help keep frustration from being woven into the work as damage. You can feel the quiet humanity of this. The worker is not a machine attached to a frame. He is flesh in weather, and the quality of his work depends on the condition of that flesh. The Ghent Tenter rules, odd as some may sound, often acknowledge the body more honestly than any abstract order for speed could do. Warm the hands, then touch the cloth, let the living tool become gentle again. When the winter hands have softened enough to feel the selvage properly, we move toward the rule about summer damp, because warmth brought its own troubles under the mill roofs. Summer in a damp textile city is not simply the opposite of winter, and in 1890s Ghent a warm day could make the finishing room heavy as a closed laundry. The rule says that cloth must not be left folded warm and damp, because warmth can hide spoilage under a pleasant softness. You may feel tempted to trust the easier air after months of cold, but warm dampness has its own quiet risks. It can sour cloth, encourage mildew, and make a folded bundle hold an unhealthy breath deep inside itself. The room changes in summer. The air presses on the skin. Shirts cling at the back. The smell of wet fiber becomes sweeter, stronger, and more quickly stale if drying is delayed. Flies may worry the window. The canal outside smells greener and thicker, with mud, weeds, warm stone, and the faint rot of things moved slowly by water. A worker wipes his forehead with a sleeve kept carefully away from clean fabric, then bends again over the frame. The rule made sense because heat can make dampness less visible. In winter, cold wet announces itself plainly to the hand. In summer, a warm fold may feel almost dry at first touch, while moisture remains within, waiting to become a smell by morning. So the tenter man opens folds, tests deeper layers, and gives the cloth more air when needed. He trusts neither comfort nor appearance completely. He asks the cloth directly, with fingers, nose, and time. There is patience in summer work, though it has a different texture from winter patience. Winter asks the body to endure cold before precision. Summer asks the body to endure heaviness without becoming slack. The rule keeps the worker from assuming that easier movement means easier finishing. Warmth can deceive. A room may feel alive and still be holding too much wet in its corners. You may sense the old city breathing slowly through the walls, canals warming under dull sun, brick giving back stored heat, and workers moving with the careful economy of people who know that haste creates more heat than it saves. The Ghent tenter man lets the cloth open, lets air pass, lets the hidden damp come forward and leave. He does not rush the bundle closed, simply because the day feels ready to close around him. As summer damp is given time to escape, and the cloth lies open under a watchful hand, we come to the rule about rain marks, those pale accusations that could appear from the smallest neglect. A rain mark on finished cloth may be faint, but faint is not the same as harmless, and in 1890s, Ghent the rule says that no clean piece should pass under a doubtful roof edge or beneath a dripping coat. This sounds obvious until you watch a crowded yard in bad weather, with workers moving quickly, carts backed near doors, bundles under arms, and water finding every seam in the day's arrangements. Rain is patient. It travels along beams, sleeves, hat brims, ropes, and the underside of ledges before falling where no one invited it. You carry a folded length with the tenterman and feel how carefully he chooses his route. A few extra steps may keep the cloth away from a dark patch on the stone. A pause under a sound lintel may be better than crossing during a sudden gust. The air smells of wet brick, hoarse coal smoke pressed low by rain, and that mineral freshness that rises when old dust is soaked. Drops strike somewhere nearby in irregular beats, too scattered to be music, too persistent to ignore. The rule made sense because water after finishing is not the same as water before finishing. Earlier, wetness belonged to the process. Later, wetness is an intruder. It can leave rings, disturb surface finish, carry dirt from a roof, or create local damp where the rest of the cloth is dry. A single drop from a sooty beam is more than water. It is water with memory of everything it touched on the way down. The worker learns the rainy geography of his workplace. He knows which door drips in west wind, which cart cover leaks near the rear corner, which passage smells too strongly of damp sacking to be trusted, and which shelf should be avoided after 2 days of steady weather. These details are not written in formal rules, but they are rules all the same, kept in the body and passed through warning gestures. Not there. Lift it higher. Wait for the drip to pass. Use the inner door. There is a calm attentiveness in this rain work, and it suits the sleepy mind. The world narrows to shelter, cloth, and the rhythm of falling water. You need only move carefully from one dry place to another, holding what has been finished away from what would mark it. The rule is old and simple. Once a thing has been made clean, do not make it prove itself again against the weather. When the bundle has crossed safely and the rain continues its patient tapping beyond the door, we move toward the rule about speaking to merchants, where the quiet worker's knowledge met the sharper language of trade. A merchant or buyer may see cloth differently from the tenterman, and in 1890s Ghent that difference could make a room feel suddenly narrower. The rule says that when asked about a piece, the worker should speak plainly about what his hands know, neither boasting nor covering, because trade language may grow polished, but cloth remains factual under the fingers. You stand near the folded length while a better coat enters the room, perhaps carrying the smell of outside air, tobacco, leather, and office paper. The cloth is opened. The questions begin. The tenterman may not be the one who sets prices or promises delivery, yet he knows whether a piece was difficult on the frame. He knows if it dried evenly, if one edge needed easing, if the final measure held, or if the weather made the work slower than usual. His words may be few. They are strongest when they are exact. Yes, the breadth held after drying. No, that corner was not cut, only eased. This mark came before tentering. The ledger has it. The rule made sense because commerce often wants certainty, and craft often lives in conditions. Weather, fiber, washing, tension, light, and time all shape the result. A worker who exaggerates may please someone for a moment and damage trust later. A worker who hides uncertainty leaves the next person unprepared. Plain speech becomes part of the finish, another smoothing of the cloth's path into the world. It does not decorate the truth, it lays it flat. You can feel the social texture of the moment. The merchant's hand may be softer or only differently worn. The worker's fingers may still show cracks and chalk. Their eyes meet briefly over the fabric, each seeing value from a different side. The room smells the same as before, but authority and money add their invisible weight. The rule steadies the tenterman within that weight. He need not become grand. He need only be accurate. There is a wider comfort in plain speech tied to real work. It does not float. It has the weight of a damp cloth lifted at dawn, the sound of hooks set along a selvage, the memory of light crossing a surface in late afternoon. When the worker says what he has seen, he brings the whole quiet day into a few words, and those words, if heard properly, can carry more truth than a long polished assurance from someone who never touched the frame. As the merchant moves on and the cloth is folded once more, we come to the rule about fatigue, the most human rule of all, though often the least formally admitted. Fatigue enters slowly, and in 1890s Ghent it may arrive before the shift is done, settling into the lower back, the feet, the neck, and the little muscles between thumb and forefinger. The rule says that when tiredness changes the hand, the task must change with it, even if only for a few minutes. A worker who can no longer feel the edge cleanly should carry, sweep, sort, mark, or warm his fingers before returning to fine setting. This is not idleness, it is preservation of the work. You can sense the difference between ordinary tiredness and dangerous tiredness. Ordinary tiredness is a weight that moves with you. Dangerous tiredness makes the hand stupid. It causes a hook to be set by habit rather than feeling, a measure to be trusted from memory rather than checked, a corner to be pulled because pulling is easier than judging. The tenter man knows the threshold because he has crossed it before. He has seen what his own fatigue can do. The room gives small ways to shift the body. Carrying a bundle uses the legs and arms differently. Sweeping loosens the back. Writing rests the grip used for cloth. Stepping to the door brings cooler air to a face grown dull from warmth and fiber. None of these pauses looks like rest to an outsider, yet each may return enough feeling to the hand for careful work to continue. The rule is subtle, and subtle rules often matter most near the end of a long day. There is kindness in admitting that attention has a body. We sometimes imagine care as a pure decision, but in the finishing room, care depends on blood, warmth, sleep, food, weather, and the ache of repeated motion. The Ghent tenterman cannot will his fingers into endless delicacy. He can only manage himself honestly, shifting tasks before fatigue becomes damage. That honesty is one of the hidden skills of the trade. You may let your own body respond to this idea, softening where it has been holding itself too firmly. The old rule does not ask for heroic endurance. It asks for enough self-knowledge to keep the next touch gentle. In a world of mills, orders, and clocks, that was a practical wisdom, and it remains restful to imagine a room where even tiredness, if noticed early, can be guided rather than fought. When fatigue has been answered with a change of task and the hand has returned to its quieter skill, we follow the last threads of the day toward the rule about leaving the frame empty, clean, and unclaimed by yesterday.